And that is the moment when I began to understand that the real turning point in human history is not controlled by governments, corporations, or technologies, but by the silent decisions we make inside ourselves every single day. The world changes when human beings change internally. Everything else is simply the outer reflection of that invisible process. I have often wondered why so many people wait for permission before trusting what they already feel in their hearts. We are trained to look outward for approval, outward for direction, outward for validation, even when the body itself is sending unmistakable signals that something is deeply out of balance. The strange part is that our biology rarely lies to us. Long before the mind creates a story, the nervous system already knows the truth. I have seen this happen in ordinary moments. A person walks into a room and instantly feels tension before anyone speaks. Another person senses that a major life change is approaching without any logical evidence. We call these experiences intuition, but I believe they reveal something much deeper. Human consciousness is constantly communicating through the body. The body is not separate from awareness. It is awareness translated into chemistry, sensation, rhythm, and emotion. Modern science is slowly beginning to recognize what many ancient traditions understood thousands of years ago without machines or laboratories. Our emotions influence the electrical patterns of the heart, the chemistry of the brain, and even the expression of our genes. Fear creates one biological response. Gratitude creates another. Compassion changes breathing patterns, hormonal balance, and neural activity in measurable ways. What we consistently feel becomes part of the biological environment inside us. This matters now more than ever because humanity is standing at what I can only describe as a choice point. A choice point is not simply a political event or an economic shift. It is a moment when the old way of thinking no longer produces stability, yet the new way of living has not fully emerged. These periods feel chaotic because competing realities begin pulling on human attention at the same time. One reality is built upon fear, division, urgency, and emotional exhaustion. The other is built upon coherence, responsibility, self-awareness, and conscious cooperation. Both realities exist simultaneously, and every day we strengthen one of them through our emotional energy, our focus, and the meaning we assign to our experiences. What fascinates me is how easily people surrender their creative power without realizing it. We are taught that our thoughts are private and insignificant, but collective human emotion shapes culture far more than most people imagine. Entire societies are influenced by repeated emotional patterns. Chronic fear narrows perception. Chronic anger reduces empathy. Chronic hopelessness weakens imagination. Over time, these emotional states become social structures. But the opposite is also true. A calm and emotionally regulated human being influences the environment around them in ways that cannot always be measured immediately. One person choosing clarity instead of panic changes family dynamics. One person practicing compassion interrupts cycles of emotional injury that may have existed for generations. These changes appear small from the outside, yet they ripple outward continuously. I believe many people sense this transformation happening already, even if they cannot fully explain it. There is a growing awareness that information alone cannot heal humanity. We have more data than any civilization in history, yet emotional suffering continues expanding because knowledge without inner wisdom becomes fragmented. We know how to connect devices across continents, but many people still do not know how to connect with themselves. That disconnect creates exhaustion. When the mind moves in one direction while the heart moves in another, the body absorbs the conflict. Stress becomes chronic, sleep becomes shallow, relationships become reactive. Eventually, people begin living in survival mode without realizing they have forgotten what genuine peace feels like. The remarkable thing is that the body often begins healing the moment internal conflict decreases. I am not suggesting that positive thinking magically solves every problem. Reality is more complex than that. But I am saying that emotional coherence changes the conditions under which the body operates. When thought, feeling, and action align, the nervous system shifts. Energy previously consumed by internal resistance becomes available for healing, creativity, and resilience. This is why belief matters so deeply. Belief is not blind acceptance. Belief is the emotional architecture through which we interpret reality. Two people can experience the same external event and emerge with completely different biological responses because their beliefs shape their perception of threat, possibility, and meaning. At this choice point, the question is no longer whether humanity possesses advanced technology or vast information. The deeper question is whether we have developed the emotional maturity necessary to use our power wisely. Human consciousness amplifies whatever emotional state directs it. Fear amplifies destruction. Awareness amplifies possibility. Compassion amplifies connection. And when enough people begin recognizing that their inner world influences the outer world, something extraordinary begins to happen because they stop seeing themselves as powerless observers trapped inside a collapsing world. They begin understanding that consciousness itself participates in reality. Every reaction becomes a signal. Every emotion becomes instruction. Every moment of attention becomes a form of energetic investment. This is why the systems built upon fear work so hard to keep human beings distracted, exhausted, divided, and disconnected from their own inner guidance. A person who trusts their deepest awareness becomes far more difficult to manipulate. They no longer depend upon external voices to define truth for them. Instead, they begin testing reality through direct experience, emotional intelligence, biological feedback, and inner clarity. That process changes everything because the moment we stop abandoning our own perception, we also stop feeding the patterns that keep humanity locked inside cycles of confusion. And perhaps that is why so many people now feel an unmistakable pressure building beneath the surface of life, because somewhere deep inside we sense that the step in human evolution will not be technological alone, but deeply emotional and conscious at the same time. I believe we are being asked to develop capacities that previous generations rarely had the opportunity to cultivate fully. Not because human beings were less intelligent in the past, but because the speed and intensity of modern life constantly pull our attention outward. The nervous system is bombarded by stimulation every hour of the day, and in that state, people gradually lose contact with their own inner signal. When a person becomes disconnected from their inner signal, they become highly vulnerable to emotional contagion. Fear spreads quickly through uncertainty. Anger spreads through repetition. Despair spreads when people feel isolated from meaning and purpose. I have watched entire populations absorb emotional states that were never originally theirs simply because they were exposed to them continuously. The body cannot remain neutral when it is surrounded by stress for long periods of time. What many people call anxiety today is often the result of living in permanent anticipation. The body prepares for danger that never fully arrives, yet the chemical response remains active. Over time, the nervous system forgets how to rest. Thoughts become fragmented. Breathing becomes shallow. Emotional resilience weakens. And eventually, people begin believing that exhaustion is normal. But exhaustion is not our natural state. Human beings were designed for rhythm, balance, recovery, and connection. The body constantly attempts to return to equilibrium, yet our habits often interrupt that process. We consume information faster than we process emotion. We suppress feelings instead of understanding them. We distract ourselves instead of becoming present with what the body is trying to communicate. This is where the ancient understanding of self-awareness becomes incredibly practical rather than philosophical. Awareness changes biology because attention itself influences the nervous system. The moment we consciously slow our breathing, the body begins responding differently. The moment we interrupt repetitive fear patterns, stress chemistry begins shifting. Even a few minutes of emotional coherence can alter heart rhythms and neural activity in measurable ways. I find it fascinating that some of the most advanced discoveries in neuroscience now echo principles that human beings intuitively understood long ago. The body listens to thought. The heart responds to emotion. Memory is not only stored mentally but physically. Trauma can become biological. So can healing, and perhaps this explains why unresolved emotional pain continues repeating across generations. If people never process fear consciously, they unconsciously transmit it through behavior, communication, and emotional conditioning. Children absorb emotional environments before they understand language. They learn safety or danger through the emotional patterns surrounding them. This means that every person who becomes more conscious is doing far more than improving their own life. They are interrupting invisible patterns that may have existed for decades. A calm parent changes the nervous system of a child. A compassionate conversation changes the emotional direction of a relationship. One emotionally aware individual can influence an entire environment without ever realizing the extent of their impact. The challenge is that true awareness requires responsibility. It is much easier to blame external conditions for every experience than to examine the emotional habits we carry internally. Yet the moment we become honest with ourselves, we begin reclaiming power that was previously scattered through unconscious reactions. I have noticed that many people fear silence because silence removes distraction. When external noise disappears, unresolved emotions often rise to the surface. Old grief appears, old confusion emerges, old fears demand attention. But this is not failure. This is the nervous system attempting to complete experiences that were never fully processed. Healing is not the absence of difficulty. Healing is the restoration of inner coherence in the middle of difficulty. That distinction changes everything. A person does not become conscious because life becomes easy. A person becomes conscious because they stop allowing external chaos to dictate their internal state completely. They begin observing their reactions instead of immediately becoming controlled by them. That small shift creates enormous transformation over time. I believe this is one of the hidden meanings behind the idea of a collective choice point. Humanity is learning that external systems alone cannot create lasting stability if individuals remain internally fragmented. We cannot build peaceful societies from chronically fearful nervous systems. We cannot create meaningful connection while remaining emotionally disconnected from ourselves. The outer world mirrors the inner condition of humanity far more than most people realize. This is why emotional mastery is not weakness. It is one of the greatest forms of intelligence available to us. The ability to remain grounded during uncertainty changes perception itself. A regulated mind sees possibilities that a fearful mind cannot recognize. A coherent emotional state increases creativity, adaptability, and clarity. And interestingly, the body rewards these states biologically. When people experience genuine appreciation, care, or emotional connection, the chemistry of stress begins decreasing, immune responses can strengthen, heart rhythms become more ordered, mental focus improves. The body shifts from protection toward restoration. In many ways, human beings are constantly teaching their biology how to live through the emotions they repeat most often. That realization carries enormous implications because it means our daily emotional patterns are not temporary experiences alone. They become instructions. Repeated fear instructs the body to prepare for danger. Repeated gratitude instructs the body to recognize safety and connection. Over time, these emotional instructions influence behavior, perception, relationships, and even identity itself. This is why awareness must become intentional. If we do not consciously choose what shapes our emotional world, external forces will choose for us. Constant outrage, endless distraction, and emotional overstimulation gradually erode the ability to think clearly. And once clarity weakens, people become reactive instead of conscious. But something remarkable happens when a person begins reclaiming attention intentionally. They stop feeding every fearful narrative. They stop reacting to every emotional trigger. They begin listening more carefully to the wisdom of the body, the quality of their thoughts, and the emotional atmosphere they create internally. At first, the change feels subtle. Then slowly, perception itself begins transforming. Situations that once created panic begin producing curiosity instead. Conflict becomes easier to navigate. Decisions become clearer. Energy becomes more stable. And perhaps most importantly, people begin realizing that peace is not something granted by the outer world alone. It is a state cultivated internally through repeated conscious choices. And I believe this is where humanity is heading now, toward a realization that consciousness is not separate from reality, but actively participates in shaping it. The thoughts we repeat, the emotions we embody, and the meanings we assign to life are constantly influencing the world we experience. Which means the real question at this choice point is not simply what kind of future awaits humanity, but what kind of consciousness humanity is willing to embody as the future begins unfolding in front of us. Because the answer to that question may determine far more than most people are prepared to imagine when they first begin looking within the silence of their own awareness and discover that underneath all the noise there is something waiting patiently to be remembered rather than learned, something ancient within human experience that has quietly remained there all along. beneath the fear, beneath the distraction, beneath the endless search for permission from the outside world to trust what we already feel deep inside ourselves. Because the moment a human being truly begins trusting that inner awareness, an entirely different relationship with reality starts to emerge. Life no longer feels like a series of random events happening to us. Instead, we begin recognizing patterns, emotional feedback, and subtle forms of intelligence operating beneath the surface of everyday experience. I have noticed that people often underestimate how much their emotional state shapes what they are capable of perceiving. Fear narrows awareness. It locks attention onto survival and immediate threat. In that condition, imagination weakens, intuition becomes quieter, and possibilities seem limited. But when the nervous system feels safe, perception expands, creativity increases, insight appears more naturally. The brain and body begin operating as a coordinated system rather than as fragmented parts fighting against each other. This may explain why some of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerge not from panic, but from moments of deep reflection, curiosity, and inner stillness. Clarity rarely arrives through emotional chaos. It emerges when the mind becomes coherent enough to recognize connections that were previously invisible. And coherence is becoming one of the most important skills of our time. We live in an age where attention is constantly being competed for. Every distraction pulls emotional energy somewhere. Every repeated message influences perception. Most people never pause long enough to ask whether the emotional atmosphere surrounding them is actually healthy for the body and mind. Yet the nervous system absorbs far more than we consciously realize. I sometimes think of the human body as an instrument continuously responding to emotional frequencies. Stress produces one pattern, appreciation produces another, hopelessness changes posture, breathing, and chemistry. Purpose changes them too. The body is always adapting to the emotional signals we repeat most consistently. What becomes dangerous is when people normalize emotional imbalance for so long that they forget another way of living is possible. They begin identifying with anxiety instead of recognizing it as a state passing through the nervous system. They identify with fear instead of observing fear. And once identification occurs, emotional patterns become harder to interrupt because they are mistaken for identity itself. But identity is far more flexible than most people were taught to believe. Human beings are constantly changing through experience, emotion, memory, and attention. Neural pathways reorganize, biological responses adapt, emotional conditioning evolves. The person we become tomorrow is influenced by what we repeatedly practice internally today. That means consciousness is not static, it is participatory. Every thought we reinforce strengthens a pathway. Every emotional habit conditions the body further. Every repeated reaction teaches the nervous system what to expect from reality. And eventually, expectations themselves begin shaping perception in powerful ways. I believe this is why hope matters biologically, not just psychologically. Genuine hope changes the internal environment of the body. It creates openness instead of contraction. It allows the nervous system to shift out of defensive survival patterns and into states more supportive of healing, connection, and innovation. The opposite is also true. When people lose all sense of meaning, the body often reflects that collapse emotionally and physically. Energy decreases, motivation weakens, stress increases. This is why purpose cannot be separated from well-being. Human beings need meaning as much as they need information. Yet modern culture often encourages people to search for meaning externally while ignoring the deeper intelligence already present within themselves. Many spend years chasing approval, status, or constant productivity without ever asking whether their emotional life is aligned with who they truly are. Eventually, the body begins answering that question for them. Sometimes it appears as burnout, sometimes chronic fatigue, sometimes emotional numbness, sometimes the quiet realization that success without inner coherence still feels empty. The body has ways of revealing when a person has drifted too far from their authentic emotional center. And this is where the choice point becomes deeply personal. It is not only about humanity collectively deciding what kind of future to create. It is about each individual deciding whether they will continue living unconsciously or begin participating in their own inner evolution with intention. That decision changes relationships first. A conscious person listens differently, reacts differently, communicates differently. They become less interested in controlling others and more interested in understanding themselves. Emotional responsibility replaces blame. Awareness replaces constant reaction. Compassion becomes possible because they no longer feel permanently threatened by every disagreement or uncertainty. I have found that one of the clearest signs of inner growth is the ability to remain present without immediately escaping discomfort. Most destructive behaviors are attempts to avoid emotional pain. Distraction, aggression, overconsumption, emotional shutdown, these patterns often emerge because people were never taught how to sit with difficult emotions consciously. But emotions are not enemies. Emotions are signals. Fear may signal uncertainty. Anger may signal violated boundaries. Sadness may signal unresolved loss. The problem begins when emotions control behavior unconsciously instead of being understood intelligently. The body becomes much more balanced when emotions are acknowledged without becoming permanent identities. Awareness creates space between feeling and reaction. In that space, choice becomes possible. And choice is power. Not the kind of power based upon domination or force, but the power of self-direction. The power to determine what emotional states we continue feeding. The power to choose coherence instead of compulsive reaction. The power to reclaim attention from systems that profit from confusion and fear. I believe humanity is gradually awakening to this realization. Although the process is uncomfortable, every transformation begins with disruption because old patterns resist change. We are witnessing outdated ways of thinking colliding with emerging levels of awareness. That collision creates tension, but tension is often present before growth. Nature itself demonstrates this constantly. Pressure transforms carbon into diamonds, muscles strengthen through resistance, forests regenerate after fire. In many ways, challenge is part of the mechanism through which life evolves. The important question is whether human beings can move through this period consciously rather than destructively. Can we learn to regulate emotion before technology amplifies our instability further? Can we rediscover empathy before division becomes normalized beyond repair? Can we remember that beneath culture, ideology, status, and external identity, human beings share the same fundamental biological and emotional needs? I believe we can, but it requires individuals willing to cultivate awareness intentionally. Instead of waiting for the world to become peaceful first, inner coherence must come before collective coherence becomes possible. And perhaps this is the deeper meaning behind everything unfolding now. Humanity is not simply being pushed toward external innovation. We are being pressured into emotional and conscious evolution at the same time. The stress we feel collectively may actually be exposing the limits of old ways of living, forcing people to recognize that survival alone is no longer enough to sustain a meaningful future. Because eventually every human being reaches a moment when they must decide whether they will continue surrendering their awareness to fear, distraction, and unconscious conditioning, or whether they will begin listening to the quieter intelligence beneath all the noise, the part of themselves that has been observing patiently from the beginning, waiting for the moment when they finally become still enough to hear what their own consciousness has been trying to reveal all along about who they truly are, beneath every layer of conditioning they inherited from the world around them. And once that deeper recognition begins unfolding, life itself starts feeling different in ways that are difficult to explain logically. The outer circumstances may not change immediately, yet our relationship with those circumstances transforms completely. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel navigable. What once triggered fear begins revealing lessons. The same world exists, but the consciousness experiencing it has shifted. I believe this is one of the greatest untapped capacities within human beings. We often assume reality is fixed, yet our experience of reality is constantly filtered through emotional perception, nervous system regulation, memory, and belief. Two people can stand in the same environment and live in entirely different psychological worlds because each person interprets experience through different internal patterns. This is why inner transformation is never merely personal. Every emotionally coherent individual subtly changes the collective atmosphere around them. Calm influences calm. Fear amplifies fear. Human beings continuously affect one another through emotional states, body language, tone, intention, and energy without fully realizing it. I have seen how one grounded person can stabilize an entire room during moments of crisis. Their presence alone changes the emotional rhythm of the environment. Breathing slows, reactions soften, clarity returns. Science may describe this through nervous system synchronization and emotional contagion, but regardless of terminology, the effect is real. The body is constantly communicating with other bodies, and perhaps that is why loneliness has become such a profound challenge in modern society. Human beings were not designed to live in emotional isolation. We are deeply interconnected biologically and psychologically. Meaningful connection regulates stress responses, strengthens resilience, and reminds people they are not carrying life alone. Yet many people are surrounded by communication while starving for genuine connection. They exchange information constantly but rarely feel truly seen. They perform identities rather than expressing authenticity. Over time, emotional performance becomes exhausting because the nervous system recognizes the difference between genuine presence and survival-based behavior. This exhaustion often pushes people toward a deeper search. At first, they may think they are searching for purpose, healing, or answers, but beneath all those desires, I believe many are actually searching for reconnection with themselves. They want to remember what it feels like to exist without constant fragmentation. Fragmentation appears in many forms. A person says one thing while feeling another. They pursue goals that conflict with their emotional truth. They ignore the body's signals for years while forcing themselves to meet external expectations. Eventually, this internal division produces emotional and physical consequences because the human system naturally seeks coherence. Coherence is not perfection. It does not mean the absence of fear or difficulty. It means alignment between thought, emotion, body, and action. When those dimensions begin working together instead of against each other, people often experience increased energy, intuition, creativity, and emotional resilience. What fascinates me is that some of the most powerful changes begin with extremely small moments of awareness. A person notices their breathing for the first time during stress. Someone pauses before reacting emotionally. Another chooses gratitude in a difficult moment instead of automatic resentment. These choices seem minor externally, yet internally they begin rewiring patterns that may have operated unconsciously for decades. Transformation rarely happens all at once. It happens through repetition. The nervous system learns through consistency. Just as repeated fear conditions the body toward survival, repeated calm conditions the body toward regulation and trust. Over time, the emotional baseline of a person changes. Situations that once produced panic no longer hold the same power because the inner foundation has strengthened. I think many people misunderstand strength completely. Real strength is not emotional suppression. It is not pretending pain does not exist. Real strength is the capacity to remain conscious while experiencing emotion without becoming consumed by it. That requires presence. And presence is becoming increasingly rare in a world built upon distraction. Most people are mentally living somewhere other than where their body actually exists. They replay the past or anticipate the future while missing the only moment where life is truly unfolding. This constant mental movement keeps the nervous system activated because the body responds to imagined stress almost as strongly as immediate stress. When people finally become present, even briefly, the body often responds with relief. Breathing deepens naturally, muscles release tension, mental noise quiets. In those moments, people sometimes experience an unexpected clarity that had been buried beneath constant stimulation. I believe this clarity is closer to our natural state than chronic anxiety ever was. Human beings possess extraordinary adaptive abilities, but adaptation can become dangerous when unhealthy conditions are normalized. Entire cultures can normalize emotional exhaustion until people forget what genuine vitality feels like. They continue functioning externally while internally disconnected from meaning, creativity, and emotional balance. But the body remembers balance even after long periods of stress. The nervous system wants to heal. The heart wants coherence. The mind wants clarity. And consciousness itself appears to move naturally toward greater awareness whenever conditions allow it. This is why creating inner stillness matters so deeply. Stillness allows hidden emotional patterns to become visible. It allows intuition to emerge beneath mental noise. It allows people to recognize which thoughts strengthen them and which thoughts slowly weaken their emotional state over time. Awareness changes everything once it becomes consistent. A conscious person begins observing the emotional effects of environments, conversations, media, and relationships. They become more intentional about what they allow into their inner world because they understand that attention is not passive. Attention feeds reality. Whatever we repeatedly focus upon gains influence inside the nervous system. If we focus constantly on fear, fear expands. If we focus intentionally on coherence, gratitude, compassion, and purpose, those states gradually strengthen biologically and emotionally. This does not mean ignoring real problems or pretending difficulty does not exist. Consciousness is not denial. In fact, true awareness often requires seeing reality more clearly than before. But clarity without fear creates very different outcomes than clarity filtered through panic. I believe humanity is learning this lesson now through experience rather than theory. We are beginning to see that external progress alone cannot create fulfillment if internal fragmentation continues growing. No amount of technological advancement can replace emotional wisdom, self-awareness, or meaningful human connection. And perhaps this realization is arriving precisely when it is needed most. Because the future will likely amplify whatever qualities already exist within human consciousness. If fear dominates, fear will scale. If awareness expands, possibility will expand alongside it. The tools humanity creates will ultimately reflect the emotional maturity of the people using them. That is why this moment matters so profoundly. Not because humanity stands at the edge of destruction, but because we stand at the edge of decision. A decision about what kind of consciousness will shape the next era of human experience. And the answer to that question will not emerge from institutions alone. It will emerge from millions of individual choices made quietly every day by ordinary people, deciding whether they will continue living disconnected from themselves or whether they will finally trust the deeper intelligence within them that has always known there is more to being human than survival, more to consciousness than thought alone, and more to life than the endless cycle of fear that so many people were conditioned to accept as normal reality. Because the moment we stop accepting fear as the foundation of human existence, we begin asking entirely different questions about what humanity is truly capable of becoming. We begin wondering whether consciousness itself has potentials that remain largely unexplored, not because they are hidden from us, but because modern life rarely creates the conditions necessary for those capacities to emerge fully. I have often reflected on how different people become when they feel genuinely safe, connected, and emotionally balanced. Creativity expands, compassion becomes easier, intuition sharpens, even the body moves differently. There is more openness in posture, more steadiness in breathing, more clarity in thought. These are not abstract spiritual ideas disconnected from biology. They are measurable shifts within the human system. And what fascinates me most is that these changes are contagious in the healthiest possible way. A regulated nervous system helps regulate other nervous systems. One calm person can influence an entire family dynamic. One emotionally conscious leader can transform the atmosphere of a workplace or community. Human beings continuously synchronize with one another emotionally, often without speaking a single word. This means the emotional state we cultivate internally matters far beyond our private experience. Every moment of awareness influences the collective field we participate in together. I think this is why periods of great uncertainty often produce two opposite reactions at the same time. Some people become more fearful, reactive, and emotionally closed. Others become more reflective, compassionate, and aware of what truly matters. Pressure reveals consciousness. It exposes the emotional patterns already operating beneath the surface. And humanity is under enormous pressure right now, not only externally through rapid technological, social, and environmental change, but internally through emotional overload. Many people are carrying stress levels their bodies were never designed to sustain continuously. The nervous system remains alert long after immediate danger has passed because modern stimulation never fully stops. Over time, people begin losing sensitivity to their own emotional condition. They become so accustomed to tension that relaxation feels unfamiliar, silence feels uncomfortable, stillness feels unproductive. Yet those very states are often where the deepest healing begins. The body repairs most effectively when safety is restored. The mind thinks most clearly when emotional noise decreases. Consciousness expands most naturally when attention becomes intentional instead of constantly fragmented. I believe many people sense this intuitively, which is why there is a growing desire for practices that restore inner balance, not as escape from reality, but as preparation to engage reality more consciously. People are beginning to understand that emotional regulation is not weakness or passivity. It is foundational intelligence. Without emotional regulation, even brilliant minds become unstable under pressure. Without self-awareness, knowledge can become destructive. Without inner coherence, external success often produces emptiness rather than fulfillment. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons emerging during this choice point. Humanity cannot solve emotionally created problems solely through intellectual force. A fragmented state of consciousness cannot produce lasting harmony, no matter how advanced the tools become. The inner condition of human beings shapes the outer systems they create. If fear dominates internally, fear eventually becomes embedded within institutions, relationships, and culture. If awareness expands internally, new possibilities emerge externally as well. Every civilization reflects the collective emotional maturity of the people building it. This is why personal transformation and collective transformation are inseparable. A person who becomes more conscious changes how they communicate, how they make decisions, how they respond to conflict, and how they influence others. They stop unconsciously transmitting emotional chaos into every environment they enter. Instead, they become stabilizing forces during uncertain times. I have noticed that emotionally aware individuals often develop a different relationship with uncertainty itself. They no longer need absolute control over every outcome because they trust their ability to respond consciously to whatever emerges. That trust reduces unnecessary fear. The body relaxes, creativity increases, adaptability strengthens. Fear always seeks certainty. Awareness seeks understanding. And there is a profound difference between the two. When people operate entirely from fear, they become easier to manipulate because fear narrows perception into survival thinking. But when awareness expands, people begin recognizing patterns they previously ignored. They question assumptions. They listen more deeply to intuition, emotional feedback, and the wisdom of direct experience. This does not make them disconnected from reality. In many ways, it makes them more connected to reality because they are no longer filtering everything through panic and conditioning alone. I believe one of the most important abilities humanity must develop now is the capacity to remain emotionally centered while surrounded by external instability. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming conscious enough that external chaos no longer completely controls internal identity. That shift changes relationships dramatically. When people stop projecting unresolved fear onto others, communication becomes clearer, defensive reactions decrease, empathy increases, genuine listening becomes possible again. Many conflicts continue not because solutions are impossible, but because emotionally dysregulated individuals cannot hear one another clearly enough to recognize shared humanity. The body itself reflects this constantly. Emotional tension contracts muscles, alters breathing patterns, and changes heart rhythms. Compassion and appreciation create entirely different physiological responses. Human biology responds moment by moment to emotional experience. In many ways, we are continuously programming our internal state through repeated emotional habits. That realization carries enormous responsibility because it means we participate in shaping our own psychological environment every day. The thoughts we rehearse, the media we consume, the conversations we repeat, and the emotional patterns we reinforce all become part of our biological conditioning over time. But awareness interrupts automatic conditioning. The moment a person becomes conscious of a pattern, choice reappears. And where choice exists, transformation becomes possible. This is why I believe the future of humanity depends as much upon emotional intelligence as technological advancement. Technology amplifies human intention. If consciousness remains fragmented, our tools will amplify fragmentation. But if awareness matures, those same tools could support healing, connection, and creative solutions beyond anything previous generations imagined possible. The critical factor is consciousness itself. Everything returns to that The quality of human attention determines the quality of human experience. A distracted mind creates distracted societies. A fearful mind creates fearful systems. A conscious mind begins creating possibilities that fear alone could never perceive. And perhaps this is why so many people feel an inner call toward greater self-understanding right now. Beneath the noise of modern life, something deeper is asking to emerge. Not a new ideology or external authority, but a more integrated form of human awareness, capable of balancing intellect with compassion, innovation with wisdom, and individuality with genuine connection. I do not believe humanity is being asked to become perfect. I believe humanity is being asked to become conscious, to recognize how deeply interconnected thought, emotion, biology, and collective reality truly are, to understand that every internal state contributes to the larger emotional atmosphere surrounding all of us, and to realize that the future may ultimately be shaped less by external events themselves and more by the level of consciousness human beings bring into those events as they unfold. Because when enough people begin reclaiming responsibility for their inner world instead of surrendering it constantly to fear, distraction, and emotional conditioning, the entire trajectory of human experience can begin shifting in ways that once seemed impossible, revealing possibilities that were present all along but hidden beneath the noise of a civilization that had forgotten how powerful conscious awareness truly is.
There comes a moment in every person's life when they begin to realize that the greatest influence shaping their experience is not only what happens around them, but what is happening within them. Most people spend years trying to control circumstances, control outcomes, or control other people. Yet they rarely stop to examine the emotional patterns quietly directing their thoughts, reactions, and biology every single day. This is where the deeper meaning of consciousness begins. Consciousness is not some distant or mysterious force reserved for philosophers or scientists. In practical terms, consciousness is simply our awareness of what we think, feel, believe, and focus on. It is the lens through which we interpret reality. And that lens affects the body far more deeply than most people realize. Modern science now confirms something many ancient wisdom traditions seemed to intuit long ago. The mind and body are constantly communicating. Thoughts influence emotions. Emotions influence chemistry. Chemistry influences physical health, energy, sleep, and even decision making. Think about a moment when you were suddenly frightened. Perhaps you received unexpected bad news or narrowly avoided an accident while driving. Before you even had time to think logically, your body reacted instantly. Your heart rate increased, your muscles tightened, your breathing changed. That reaction happened automatically because the nervous system was responding to perceived danger. Now imagine the opposite experience. Think about a moment when you felt deeply appreciated, loved, or safe. Notice how differently the body responds. Breathing slows, muscles soften, the mind becomes clearer. You feel more open and connected. These are not imaginary effects, they are biological responses. The body is always listening to emotional signals. This becomes extremely important because many people unknowingly live in a constant state of emotional stress. The modern world keeps the nervous system overstimulated through endless information, pressure, uncertainty, and distraction. Over time, the body begins treating emotional stress as a normal condition. But the body was never designed to remain in survival mode continuously. Imagine holding your fist tightly closed all day long. At first, it feels manageable, but eventually the muscles become exhausted. Emotional tension works the same way. Chronic fear, resentment, worry, and emotional overload slowly drain the body's energy because the nervous system never fully relaxes. This is why emotional awareness matters so much. When we become conscious of our emotional state, we gain the ability to interrupt automatic patterns. Instead of being controlled by them unconsciously, awareness creates choice. For example, many people react to stress immediately without noticing what is happening internally first. Someone criticizes them, and anger appears instantly. An unexpected challenge arises and panic takes over. But when awareness develops, something powerful begins to happen. A small space opens between the emotional trigger and the reaction. Inside that space, wisdom becomes possible. Instead of reacting automatically, we can pause, breathe, and choose our response consciously. This may sound simple, but biologically, it changes everything. Slow breathing signals safety to the nervous system, calm attention reduces stress chemistry, gratitude and appreciation create different heart rhythms than fear and frustration. Over time, these small shifts help retrain the body toward greater balance and resilience. One of the easiest ways to understand this is by thinking about physical exercise. If someone never moves their body, muscles weaken over time. Emotional regulation works similarly. The more we practice calm awareness during everyday challenges, the stronger our emotional resilience becomes. Eventually, situations that once overwhelmed us begin feeling manageable because the nervous system has learned a new pattern. This is also why repeated thoughts matter so deeply. The brain strengthens whatever patterns we practice most often. If a person constantly repeats fearful thoughts, the nervous system becomes conditioned toward anxiety and stress. But if someone intentionally practices gratitude, calm focus, and constructive thinking, different neural pathways strengthen instead. In other words, the mind becomes shaped by repetition. This does not mean ignoring real problems or pretending life is always positive. True awareness is not denial. Difficult emotions are part of being human. Fear, sadness, frustration, and uncertainty all carry important information. The key is learning to experience emotions without allowing them to completely control our identity or behavior. Imagine standing in the rain. You notice the rain, you feel it, but you do not become the rain itself. Emotions are similar. They move through us, but they are not the total definition of who we are. This understanding becomes life changing because many people unconsciously identify with every emotional state they experience. They say, I am anxious, rather than noticing, I am experiencing anxiety right now. That small difference creates emotional freedom because it reminds us that emotional states can change. Another important idea is the connection between attention and reality. Whatever we focus on repeatedly grows stronger in our awareness. If we constantly consume fear driven information, the mind begins seeing danger everywhere. If we focus intentionally on solutions, growth, and meaningful connection, perception gradually shifts in a healthier direction. Attention is like sunlight for the mind. Whatever receives attention begins growing. This is why daily habits matter more than occasional inspiration. Small repeated actions shape consciousness over time. 5 minutes of quiet reflection every morning can slowly change emotional patterns. Practicing gratitude before sleep can improve mental focus and emotional stability. Spending time in nature can calm an overstimulated nervous system. Even simple moments of stillness can have powerful effects. Many people fear silence because silence exposes unresolved emotions. Yet silence is often where clarity begins. When distractions decrease, we finally hear what the body and mind have been trying to communicate beneath all the noise. Practical awareness does not require perfection. It requires consistency. Start by observing your emotional patterns without judgment. Notice how certain environments affect your energy. Pay attention to how your breathing changes during stress. Ask yourself whether the thoughts you repeat daily are strengthening your peace or feeding your fear. Most importantly, remember that transformation happens gradually. Just as the body changes through repeated physical habits, consciousness changes through repeated emotional and mental habits. Small shifts practiced consistently create powerful long term results. And perhaps the deepest lesson of all is this: human beings are far more connected to themselves, to one another, and to life itself than they were taught to believe. Every thought influences emotion, every emotion influences biology. Every internal state influences the energy we bring into the world around us. When we begin understanding that connection clearly, we stop seeing ourselves as powerless observers trapped inside circumstances. We begin recognizing that every moment offers a choice about what kind of emotional state we will cultivate within ourselves. And over time, those choices quietly shape not only our personal reality, but the collective future humanity creates together.